There was such a silence in the courtroom, as if even breaths were being taken. With permission, reporters leaned at the edges of their seats, pens hovering over notepads. Every eye on the door, every heart waiting. Then the doors creaked. A hush spread across the entire courtroom, and in walked the man whose every word was about to turn the nation's speculations into reality. FBI agent Dalen Meadow, the man who had led the raid on Martin Wesley's luxurious Beverly Crest estate. He was neither a celebrity nor was there any showmanship in his demeanor. But the moment he reached the witness stand, the entire courtroom leaned forward. Because now this wasn't rumor or assumption, it was federal truth. Judge Barrett nodded. Prosecutor Claire Vaughn stepped forward. Her voice calm, but every word heavy. Agent Meadow, please tell the court what you found in the hidden location on Mr. Wesley's Beverly Crest estate. For a few moments, Agent Meadow simply stared ahead. Then slowly he began to speak as if each word was dropping heavily to the ground. It was a hidden USB, concealed behind a double wall, and required special tools to extract. A wave of whispers ran through the courtroom. No employee had access to this USB. Even the household staff was unaware of its existence. Martin Wesley sat silently with his lawyer. His hands clenched together, the knuckles turning white. Agent Meadow continued. After decrypting the USB, what we found wasn't just information, but a plan. The prosecutor asked, "What kind of plan?" Meadow drew a breath. Dozens of folders, each containing personal files on businessmen, investors, or former partners. Videos, audio recordings, unregistered contracts, and evidence of some secret payments. Silence once again fell over the courtroom. But this time it was a silence of fear. Judge Barrett lowered his gaze. The jury grew restless. One juror's leg began to shake involuntarily. This hidden USB wasn't just a backup, Agent Meadow said. It was a control system. Then he gave the courtroom a single word. Index. There was a file in the USB called Index. A list. Business figures, politicians, media houses, each name tagged with a category. Owned, owed, watch, or target. The prosecutor asked, "Are you saying the defendant, Mr. Wesley, had created a list of individuals he had influence over?" "Yes, and it had a personal name, the network." The courtroom seemed frozen. The network. It wasn't just a name. It was an admission of a system. Prosecutor Claire Vaughn wasted no time before launching the next question. Agent Meadow, do the files within this network suggest any specific intent? Agent Meadow nodded. A folder on the USB revealed the most dangerous truth. The folder was titled, Pending Insurance, Level Red. The tension in the courtroom was so thick that several reporters held their breath. Level Red, according to the FBI, indicates a classification used for materials that either pose a threat to national security or have the capability to directly harm human life. Fine lines had appeared on Judge Barrett's forehead. A man in the jury took a sip of water, but his hand trembled slightly. Agent Meadow went into detail. There were dozens of files in that folder. Videos, covert audio clips, details of financial transactions, and forged documents kept specifically to blackmail or destroy targeted individuals. Claire Vaughn asked, "Were these insurances?" Meadow's eyes hardened. No. This wasn't insurance. It was criminal preparation. A system designed to purchase silence to activate only when someone resisted. Several eyes in the courtroom now met each other. The silence wasn't for listening anymore. It was for understanding. Meadow turned a page. In one clip, a well-known business executive is seen in a private villa lawn, speaking during a private conversation about his past, family matters, and legal threats. The video camera was hidden inside a lamp. He had no idea he was being recorded. The prosecutor asked, "Were these individuals aware they were under surveillance?" Absolutely not. And that was the deadliest part. Agent Meadow continued the explanation. Each video came with metadata. When it was recorded, where and what stage the individual was in at the time, a new contract, financial pressure, or a personal crisis. These weren't just recordings. They were preloaded files for potential attacks. Meadow looked down as he gave a final example. An emerging businessman once asked Wesley for better terms. Wesley smiled and said, "You want freedom? I have your Vegas video. Don't even dream about it." And the man fell silent. The air in the courtroom felt frozen. Agent Meadow raised his head and said, "This USB didn't just contain data. It was an entire system, one that turned silence into policy and fear into a principle. And all of it was controlled by just one man, Martin Wesley." Martin Wesley was still seated in the chair, but the tension on his face was screaming louder than his silence. His face was straight, yet his eyes were hollow, as if the blow of reality had struck somewhere deep inside. Agent Meadow, after a brief pause, turned the next page. While analyzing the contents of the USB, we found another folder. Guest Risk Tier A. The pressure in the courtroom became even more intense. A juror clenched his lips. A reporter set his pen down. These were the individuals who had entered Wesley's homes, offices, or private events as guests, and they didn't know that their every moment was being recorded. Meadow's voice now seemed to fill even the empty spaces. Cameras were hidden in bedrooms, offices, private clubs, even in personal lounges. This surveillance wasn't based on consent, it was based on design. Then he opened the next file. We found another folder, Handlers. This folder was even more dangerous. A crease formed on Prosecutor Claire Vaughn's forehead. Meadow explained. It contained written scripts, behavioral instructions and psychological strategies, what to say to whom, when to apply pressure, whom to guilt and whom to emotionally manipulate. Each target had a separate profiling, as if they weren't people but blueprints. The courtroom now felt filled with an unseen emptiness. Agent Meadow now picked up another page, the very page that had triggered a state of emergency within their agency. We found a folder bound in leather. Phase 4, Collapse Protocol. This time, absolute silence fell over the courtroom. No pens moved. No breaths came fully. Meadow measured each word before speaking. This was a complete manual. If Wesley were to be arrested, assassinated, or if a major scandal broke out, what should be leaked to the media, which videos to release, and which ally to push forward as a shield. This wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a professional defensive war plan, crafted at the level of a psychological expert. Judge Barrett took a deep breath. But even that breath sounded weary, as if the law itself felt helpless. Agent Meadow lowered his head and said, "In our lives, we've seen many pieces of evidence, but a USB where every file is a chain. This was the first time." Prosecutor Claire Vaughn stepped forward slowly, as if she knew that the next question, the next answer, would not just shake the courtroom, but awaken it. "Agent Meadow, do you have any evidence that this entire system, this surveillance, these files, this collapse protocol, was built with someone else's help?" Agent Meadow lowered his head, then raised it, and said, "Yes. We found a folder on the USB titled Legacy Re-Edit." Some people in the courtroom leaned forward on their seats. Meadow opened the page. This folder contained records of connections, payments, and secret agreements with various media houses, journalists, and public relations firms. It detailed which story to spread where, what to give to which reporter in what language, and through which platform's silence was to be bought. Judge Barrett's eyes had stilled. A juror pressed their knee under the desk, as if the blood flow itself had started to freeze. Agent Meadow held up a receipt image to the court. This is a record of a payment made to a well-known media outlet through a shell company, $2.5 million, purpose, to suppress a major leak. The prosecutor asked, "Was this a system of media control?" "This was the engineering of narrative," Meadow said. "To suppress the truth and create a new one that favored Wesley." Then he made another revelation, and this time, it felt like the courtroom forgot how to breathe. Inside the USB, we found an encrypted folder. Its name was Icarus. The prosecutor immediately asked, "And inside?" Meadow lowered his head, closed his eyes, then shut the file and said, "A video. 27 minutes long. No editing, no music. Just Martin Wesley, alone, confessing." The reporters in the room didn't write, didn't speak. Pens froze. Breaths halted. Agent Meadow fixed his gaze on the jury and said, "The video is still secured, but in it he confesses to everything. How he conducted surveillance, how he built the files, who he blackmailed, through whom he manipulated the news, and how he turned silence into currency." Then, Meadow bowed his head and spoke a single sentence, one that froze the courtroom entirely. And in the end, he looks at the camera and smiles, and says, I know you'll never open this video. You don't have the courage, because I'm not the one who buys silence. I create it. Judge Barrett did not strike the gavel. He simply remained seated in his chair, a stillness on his face, as if even the law, at times, is left stunned. In front of the jury, Agent Meadows' testimony had now become more than just documentation. It was an experience. The reporters had set down their phones. They were now only listening. Prosecutor Claire Vaughn softly asked, "Agent Meade, do you have any proof that this USB was solely under Martin Wesley's control?" Meadow took a moment before answering, then said, "Yes." Inside the USB was an access log. Every time it was decrypted, every time a file was opened, the time, date, and device ID were recorded, and every single entry was linked to Wesley's personal encrypted system. The prosecutor requested a file, and the log was displayed on a screen before the court. First access, 3 years ago. Last access, 6 weeks ago, and in between, a total of 92 uses, all from the same ID. Martin Wesley was still silent, but the calm in his eyes was no longer there. Now there was only waiting, or perhaps the knowledge of the end. Agent Meadow lowered his gaze and said, "We did not make a copy of the USB. We did not leak it. We wanted this courtroom to be the first place where its truth would come to light." Then, for the first time, Judge Barrett turned on his microphone to speak. "Agent Meadow, in your opinion, is this USB just evidence or a weapon?" Meadow raised his head and without hesitation replied, "It is both evidence for those who seek justice and a weapon for those who fear it." Judge Barrett closed his eyes and took a deep breath, then looked around every corner of the courtroom, as if he were not just a representative of justice, but listening to the moral pulse of the nation. Prosecutor Claire Vaughn set her notes aside. Now her words held less legal reasoning and more human pain. "Agent Meadow, after all this evidence, can you tell us if any individual's life was directly endangered by these files?" Meadows' voice turned firm. The gentleness gone, only truth remained. "Yes, we found 2 such cases where Wesley's files were used. One businessman committed suicide, and the other left his company and chose to disappear completely. Both had files listed in the index, and those files contained videos, affairs, and financial details. Now only bodies remained in the courtroom, as if the souls had drifted into a quiet mourning. Claire Vaughn asked, "Isn't that murder? Even if indirect? Isn't this the kind of face of power that only survives in the shadows?" Agent Meadow said, "This wasn't the face of a shadow. It was the shadow itself, and the USB was its mirror." The jury members were now avoiding each other's eyes. Perhaps they understood. This case wasn't just about Martin Wesley. It was a trial of the entire system. Then, the prosecutor asked one final question. "Agent Meadow, if it were up to you, what should be the fate of this USB?" Meadow thought for a moment, then softly said, "It should be preserved in history, so that future generations can know that silence is never just silence, and sometimes the price of truth is greater than life itself." There were no bells ringing in the courtroom, but hearts were. Martin Wesley's silence was no longer silence. It had become a closed door, behind which everyone could hear the echo of their own unanswered questions. Judge Barrett picked up his pen and cast a glance toward the jury. Prosecutor Claire Vaughn stepped forward and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the prosecution has completed its testimony. We respectfully request that the jury be allowed to retire for deliberation." Judge Barrett nodded and began instructing the jury, but just as the jury began to leave the room, a new voice suddenly echoed. "Excuse me, Your Honor, I have an additional statement." All eyes turned to the man, who had been sitting in the back rows. A young man, white shirt, blue jeans, and a trembling voice. His name was Nick Holland. Claire Vaughn immediately stood up. "Nick Holland? You were part of Martin Wesley's former project team?" Nick nodded. "I was the one who wrote the system that built the USB. I knew what it was going to be used for, but I closed my eyes. Because Wesley paid for my father's medical treatment." A fresh breath passed through the courtroom. This confession was not only technical, but moral. Nick said, "But now every night I dream that I myself am trapped inside that USB, and someone is unlocking my secrets. That's why I'm here to give my testimony. With no deal, no protection. Claire Vaughn requested permission from the court, and Judge Barrett nodded. Nick Holland, your testimony is accepted. But remember, your truth is no longer just a word. It is a responsibility. Nick Holland took a sip of water, but his hands were still trembling. I know that what I'm about to say could put me in legal jeopardy. But if I stay silent, then I remain part of the very system that not only stole lives, but buried the truth. Prosecutor Claire Vaughn asked gently, Nick, can you explain how the encryption you created was used by Wesley? Nick closed his eyes, as if laying his heart out on the table. I built a dual-layered structure within the USB. The outer layer was for the index files, and the inner core, which we called the black loop. That loop automatically monitored the individuals, whose files were stored in the USB, their emails, their phones, even the security cameras in their homes. The courtroom felt like a scene out of a science fiction film, but this story was real. Nick said, Wesley once told me, I don't buy people's conscience. I delete their choices. Judge Barrett sat up straight in his chair and asked, and was anyone physically targeted? Through this black loop? Nick softly said, yes. During a business conference, a man's presentation was sabotaged. Right at the moment he was about to speak against Wesley. That man is still in the hospital, semi-conscious. The silence that followed was the kind that only arrives after witnessing the funeral of truth. Claire Vaughn finally asked, all we want to ask is this. Can you provide the court with a technical explanation of this hidden portion of the USB so we can understand that this wasn't just a data tool, but a psychological warfare mechanism? Nick Holland nodded. I'm ready to present my full technical documentation before the court, with no protection, because what I created wasn't knowledge, it was death, in the form of silence. After Nick Holland's testimony, the courtroom, the judge, the jury, the reporters, all spent a few moments in silence. It felt as if words were insufficient, and everyone was searching within themselves for some silent complicity in a crime. Prosecutor Claire Vaughn finally presented the file to the court that Nick had named the Black Loop structure. This documentation not only reveals the USB's use, tracking, and manipulation, but also shows how one human being can become the owner of another's freedom. The file listed 12 private investors, 9 former partners, 4 political aides, 7 regulatory board members. Each of their personal behavior profiles had been stored in the USB under separate response categories. Silence, discredit, threaten, replace. Judge Barrett removed his glasses and said, this file is not just a record of crime. It is a blueprint of the blindness of power. Martin Wesley was still silent, but now his eyes occasionally paused on the jury, as if he were calculating how many consciences had awakened and how many were still asleep for a price. Claire Vaughn submitted a new document into the court record. This is an audio recording in which Martin Wesley is speaking with one of his financial advisors. He says, people don't die from silence. They die when they believe no one is listening. Every person in the courtroom at that moment seemed to pass through a personal reflection. Then, Claire Vaughn spoke to the court one final time. My lord, this is not just a financial crime. It is a crime against collective memory. It is a betrayal of the promise of justice we all made under the Constitution. Judge Barrett looked at the jury, then took a deep breath. This court will deliver its verdict tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Until then, this court is adjourned. The next morning, there was a crowd outside the courthouse. Businessmen, journalists, ordinary citizens, even those who had never been part of any headline, had come today just to hear one verdict. Judge Barrett entered the courtroom, a strange stillness on his face, as if through the night he had read not just the law, but his own heart. The foreperson of the jury stood and handed over the slip to deliver the verdict. The judge read it aloud. Martin Wesley is found guilty of federal conspiracy, extortion, invasion of privacy, and psychological coercion. Silence filled the courtroom. Then a deep breath, as if the entire nation had, for the first time, felt real air. There was no anger on Wesley's face, no sorrow, just a restless stillness, like the face of an artist who has lost the stage, but refuses to step out of character. Judge Barrett said, "This court has ruled not only on the evidence, but on the moral wound this USB inflicted upon the nation. And for that, this court sentences Martin Wesley to 35 years in prison, without parole, without leniency." Nick Holland sat with tears in his eyes, but his breathing had grown lighter. Perhaps redemption doesn't always come from words, but from actions. As Agent Meadows stepped outside the courthouse, reporters called out, "What do you feel? Has justice been served?" Meadow looked up at the sky, then softly said, "Justice is never complete. But today, silence has been defeated.